En este último bloque tenemos la tercera ponencia. La doctora MERIEL MOORE-COLYER nos va a presentar la plática Nutrición en el caballo deportivo. La doctora MERIEL está adscrita a la Real Universidad de Agricultura en Cirencester, United Kingdom. Ella es doctora en nutrición equina por la Universidad de Edimburgo en Escocia y actualmente es profesora de pregrado y posgrado en ciencia equina en la Real Universidad de Agricultura, ahí mismo en Cirencester, United. Es directora de investigación e intercambio académico de la Real Universidad de Agricultura y es miembro de la Sociedad Británica de Ciencia Animal. En actividad privada, ella es editora de publicaciones relacionadas con ciencia equina y sus líneas de investigación son básicamente nuevos alimentos y sistemas de alimentación para potros, alergenos respiratorios y sistemas de tratamiento para forrajes. Perfil microbiológico, contenido de nutrientes del forraje en relación con la salud intestinal, salud respiratoria, ambiente del establo y sistemas de mitigación. Tiene numerosas publicaciones científicas al respecto durante el ejercicio de toda su vida profesional y es un placer recibir también entonces a la doctora MERIEL. Muchísimas gracias, doctora. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to talk at this conference again. I'm hoping sometime I might be able to visit Mexico again because I thoroughly enjoyed coming out there. Today I'm going to talk to you about a topic that is very close to my heart, is feeding the dressage horse. And I was very lucky to have a horse of my own that I was able to train up to Grand Prix. And while I wasn't any great shakes at it, particularly myself, I did mix with lots of people who were very good at dressage. And so I learned an awful lot about how they manage their horses. So today is going to be a bit of a combination about reasons behind why we need to feed these horses the way we do, and a little bit more of an update on recent research and how that impacts the sort of feed that we are giving our horses. So there are many challenges facing the dressage horse. And the first one is the actual type of work that this horse does. It's power and sustained work. So we want the horse to be able to do these really demanding exercises, such as this one that we see the very famous Totalas doing with Edward Gall doing a piaffe here. But to train up to that level, and because horses learn through repetition, they can be suffering quite a lot and quite silently really from repetitive strain injury. They can also, with constant use of similar muscle groups, can get lactic acid buildup. And of course, as you would expect, doing a similar sort of exercise again and again, you get concussion and wear on joints. And one of the biggest reasons for loss of dressage horses is problems with the hocks and stifles. And this picture, I think, demonstrates that very well, because you can see the horse literally is sitting and able to do his piaffe. So what can we do to get over this? Well, first of all, within session and between session recovery rates. Now, I'll go into more reasons about why that's so important later on, but it's very easy, because we work our horses in a repetitive way, to just keep going, to keep training. So I'm going to work on this, I'm going to work on this, and you forget to stop and let the horse stretch. And that is of utmost importance when training, as indeed is the downtime and the variability of the training activities. So dressage horses should be out hacking. They should also be doing some fast work, and many of them love to do a bit of gymnastic jumping. So anything to vary the activities, but also to keep the horse sweet and use all the muscles in the body, not just those specifically used for dressage. And of course, we want to feed a diet that promotes muscle anabolism and recovery. And we're going into that shortly. The second challenge that I see dressage horses facing is that of traveling. Traveling produces a lot more muscular work and strain on horses than we realize. They also can get dehydrated when traveling, and they can get heat stressed when traveling. And that's more likely to occur in Mexico, although we have had some very hot summers here over the last number of years, and temperatures of upwards of the high 20s, low 30s can still cause heat stress in horses. So to mitigate those problems, we should look at how the horse prefers to balance himself. And that's often traveling backwards. So most horses, if they're put loose in a box, will turn themselves around and travel backwards. If you can't travel backwards, then at least travel them sideways. It's much better than traveling frontways. It's much less muscular work. It's very important to have airflow going through the box. Don't worry about, if you're worried about chill factor, then put a rug on the horse, but make sure that there's plenty of good ventilation, because that's very important for respiratory health. And associated with that, if you're traveling for more than a couple of hours, I really do insist that people stop and let the horse out of the box and get his head down. Now, that's very important for the draining of the respiratory tract and that mucociliary escalator to work and actually drain out properly. And if you don't do that, then horses can suffer from what they call travel sickness. And if you've ever had a horse, like I have, that has suffered from travel sickness, it's very frightening and it's potentially very dangerous for the horse. And it's simply easy to avoid that if you allow the horse to put his head down and to just move and stretch around a little bit. A diet with electrolytes when you're traveling is very important. And as Dr. Crandall has just said, you need to be giving these to the horse in the feed for a number of days beforehand. And in fact, I would suggest if you're working in a reasonably warm climate, you give electrolytes as a matter of course. But to maintain that good digestive system while traveling, you need a dust-free, highly digestible and palatable forage. So buy the best forage you possibly can and feed and make sure it's as dust-free as you can, and allow the horse to eat when he's traveling. If he eats when he's traveling, it reduces the stress and keeps the digestive system working well. The third and last challenge I see is the competition itself. The muscle strain of the competition should be similar, if you've done your training correctly, to what you're doing in training. But the mental stress can be significantly greater. And we need to be aware of this when we take horses out. So you've got to do some gradual habituation. Take them to small competitions, make sure that they are being schooled and ridden with other animals in the arena. Take your own forage. Don't rely on, even if you're going away for a few overnight stays, take your own forage. That will ensure that the horse will eat what it is that you want him to do so. So keep the diet the same. You might afterwards have to, again, as Dr. Crandall just said, increase the starch content a little bit to replenish glycogen reserves. But before the competition, you should keep the diet the same and not change anything. And the last thing that I see a lot going on in competitions is the riders don't cool down their horses between classes. So it's often very easy to finish your dressage test, and then you dash back to the lorry and you tell everybody how it's going, and you think, well, I'll take the tack off the horse, etc. Really, what you should do is go back into the arena and stretch the horse long and low, and probably do that at a slow trot, because that's much more effective at dispersing lactic acid than just walking. But that's what will make him fresh to come out for the next test, and indeed help him to be fresh for the next day, because it just takes the lactic acid out of the deep muscle bed. So those are our challenges that we're facing with dressage horses. Now, what are the 4 things to consider when we are compiling a diet? Well, first of all, you've got to meet nutrient requirements. I think that goes without saying. But we've also got to maintain the horse's health. And I'm talking about physical and mental health. For people working in hot countries or doing longer rides or doing maybe 3 or 4 tests in the day, you've got to minimize heat increment, particularly in hot countries. Now, this is the heat that's lost as a result primarily of fermentation. So it's one of the slightly downsides of fiber. And there are ways in which we can manipulate the diet to ensure that that's not overburdensome for a horse working in a hot environment. And the other thing that there's been a lot of work done recently on the glycemic index. So this is the level of soluble carbohydrates in the feeds and how much that puts up the insulin level of the blood. And we know now an awful lot more about hyperinsulinemia and the effect it has on metabolic disorders. So we want to be able to feed our concentrates in the right way that help us without actually causing any metabolic disorders. So first of all, meeting nutrient requirements. Well, I'm going to tell you a little sort of negative story, first of all, because there's no doubt about it. The equine population across the world is getting fatter. We have a major obesity issue in the UK. And I think that we've got to be very aware of this when we're feeding our horses. So it's very important to set the energy requirements accurately. We have showing classes here, and I'm sure you do in Mexico as well, where judges look favorably, really, on fat horses. And sometimes you want to see horses well-rounded and in nice condition, but sometimes the muscle development is mistaken, and they think it's the fat horse is well muscled. Well, it's not. It's very different. So you need to have a nice muscle development, but the horse shouldn't be carrying excess fat. If he is, then he's carrying a higher body weight for his frame. And that increases the workload of the animal, which in turn increases the lactate levels, so that the horse will reach lactic acid thresholds sooner. It will increase the heart rate because the horse is under stress. And actually, during all the other time, the rest time, etc., the blood actually has a higher level of inflammatory proteins. So any little activity that's going on there in terms of sort of a small bit of inflammation or etc., the body's not going to be able to deal with very well because it's already dealing with high levels of inflammation. Heat production when an animal is working with a lot of weight is higher. And the higher body weight to surface area ratio means that sweating is just simply less effective, because you've got a different ratio to what the animal should have with regards to his frame. So there might be sweating a lot, but it's less effective than if he was lighter. And it's interesting to note that body condition score, when it increases greater than a 6 on the Henke system, you get an exponential rise in fat accumulation. So you will get fat accumulation going along if you're overfeeding at a fairly steady rate, and then you hit a point and it literally just shoots right up. So 1 point of body score is a minimum addition of 25 kilograms of fat. So if you increase the body condition score, you think, well, I've only gone from a 4.5 to a 5, etc. Well, you've added the weight of a bag of feed onto that horse. So that's a burden for the horse. And we must be very careful not to get near those levels. There are also been reported 80 architectural changes in heart muscle in obese horses. Now, the last thing we need is a horse with a dicky heart when we're trying to compete him. Doing these passage, piaffe, really extended trots and half passes, they are really very hard work on the musculature. And the horse's heartbeat does rise quite a bit. And so you want to be sure that that heart is there working and pushing the blood around and helping to disperse the lactic acid, rather than actually faulting because of because it's got too much fat around it. The excess fat will interfere with the gait rhythm, and you do get asymmetry in the hind limbs. Now, that is the last thing you need for a horse doing dressage, because you're looking all the time, you're being assessed on the straightness and the purity of the stride. And so if you've got some asymmetry, you'll simply be thrown out. And it might just be because the horse is carrying too much weight, or that he's got a joint issue because he's carrying too much weight. And of course, the other thing that we see a lot in dressage horses, which stresses me a lot, is the fact that we get laminitis. Laminitis is highly prevalent in dressage horses. And if you've seen a horse again with severe laminitis, you don't ever want to see another one. The pain must be excruciating. So, once a horse has had laminitis, they are susceptible to other episodes. So really, you've done a tremendous disservice by having an obese horse. So the best thing to do is to calculate the daily energy requirements in an accurate way. And here I'm going to unashamedly promote the work of my PhD student and myself, what we did in 2020. Now, I think I have mentioned this before, but I just wanted to relate this to how we calculate the actual energy requirements, because it's actually a very easy thing to do. So first of all, as you would do using any other energy requirement system, we've got to calculate the energy required for maintenance. Now, this formula, which is the live weight times the 0.118, which is a metallizable energy value, was based on 60 sports horses. There were 20 here in the UK and 40 in Sweden. And these horses were doing a range of activities, but they were all in the Olympic sports. So they were doing show jumping, a high number doing dressage and eventing. Most of the horses were training at a reasonable level, so these weren't ordinary leisure horses. And so they generally had only one day off a week. And these are the amount of energy that they required, A, for maintenance. And you see there's another formula there, 0.018 of megajoules of metallizable energy per day is required for exercise. So in fact, work is really only a small additional proportion of feed on top of the energy requirements for maintenance. So how we simply use this is you take the live weight of your horse, multiply it by 0.118, and you get the total energy expenditure for maintenance. Then you can do one or two things. You can take this formula, live weight times 0.018, and you get the total energy expenditure for exercise. Add them together, you get the total energy requirement that is needed for that day. Convert it to DE. If you like to use DE, just multiply the ME by 1.2, and you have the daily energy requirements in digestible energy. So just as a little bit of an example, we had a 600 kilogram horse here, calculated the EEM, and that results in 71 megajoules of metallizable energy per day. Then the energy expenditure for exercise, so that the amount of energy that the horse uses to train over that week is 11 megajoules of metallizable energy per day. Look how much lower that is than maintenance. So the total energy requirement then for this horse is 82. Want to convert that to digestible energy, multiply by 1.2. So you've got a 98.4 megajoules of digestible energy per day is what that horse requires to do the work and to maintain his body in the top condition and help to do the muscle regeneration and repair that is needed. If you don't want to be bothered doing this equation, you simply take the megajoules for maintenance, you multiply it by 15% and add it onto that, and you'll come up with the same answer. It's just something that rather than keeping two formula in your head, it's just easy to do that. Now, the reason that I'm promoting this is because the NRC 2007 have produced energy requirements and protein requirements, vitamins and minerals for horses. And they need to be praised for doing this because they're the first group that have actually done this. And I mean, okay, they was started in 1968, but nonetheless, they've actually put forward something for us to work to. But the basis on which their calculations were quite different to our modern day sports horses. The horses were different, the competitions were different, the activities were different. And so when we now look at our horses and those doing these Olympic sports, dressage and show jumping and eventing, if you use the NRC 2007 recommendations, you can be overfeeding energy by 111%. And that's what gives us fat horses. So it's important to use the most up-to-date information so that you know you can calculate this accurately. So we've now got the amount of energy that we need to feed the horse. What dictates how we feed that? Well, we know that dressage horses need slow release energy, and they need enough energy and protein for development and repair. But also, very importantly, is they need to maintain digestive health. So we've got to work with that digestive physiology. And earlier on, we had a very nice run through about what goes on in the digestive tract and the rate of passage and the importance of water. Because we want to have a maximum output from the feed we give. So we want to maximize digestion and fermentation. Because of the issues with any horse carrying extra weight in the gut, which can interfere with performance, we don't want ballast. We don't want useless ballast in there, which can happen if you feed straw, because the microbes can't deal with that. It's very lignified. It takes a long time to get anything from it. And it's taking up gut space that could be used for putting higher nutrient content in there. So we need to focus on quality fiber. And we also need to be aware that voluntary food intake, around about 16 hours per day eating, is very important to maintain for mental health. Horses are supposed to be foraging. That's what they evolved to do. And we need to ensure that the way we feed them gets as close to that ideal as we possibly can. So obviously, as Dr. Crandall has just said, fiber is the base of all. We all know that fiber is very important. It's very important for dressage horses because it's slow release energy. It also improves the time budgets, allows the horse to do what it should do, the natural trickle feeding. It also generally, if it's well conserved and from good soils, will have a good dietary cation-anion balance. And that's quite important for maintaining the right pHs in the right place in the gut. But it's also important when horses are producing lots of lactic acid because they're working. Then, again, dependent on the soil and the conditions, but on the whole, minerals and vitamins, what's in fiber, are more available for absorption in the horse because they're naturally chelated. They're attached to sugars and proteins within the forage. But the area that I want to concentrate on, and we've just touched on the last couple of lectures, is that fiber promotes a diverse microbiome. And this is extraordinarily important for maintaining health and performance of horses. So there was a really neat study done by Mark et al. in 2020, and they looked at 185 horses, of which nearly half were dressage horses. And they found that their microbiome was highly individualistic, so 52.6% variation in that population. But they did find that there was a core of 29 genera, 52% firmicute phyla, and 90% of these were in the top 30 abundances. So although they were very variable, there did seem to be a bit of a core, that there was a commonality in the core. However, the profile of the microbiome changed according to time. So when they sampled these horses 8 months apart, the microbiome was different from the first sample to the second sample. And this undoubtedly is due to maybe slightly dietary changes, diet and temperature, etc. But because your horse has got a healthy microbiome, doesn't mean it's always going to have a healthy microbiome. So you've got to watch that. And you can watch this yourself. Great, marvelous. If you want to go sequence it and see what's there, that's fine. Very costly and time consuming. But we can monitor things like fecal pH and aerobic fungi loads. And these are things that we can see. If they start to differ, then we're changing the microbiome. The microbiome is changing, and it might not be in a positive way. So similar microbiome in horses was seen in this group of horses within the same discipline. Now, often we get questions about, are breeds the same? Do the same sorts of horses breeds have the same microbiome? Or if they're in the same yard, do they have the same microbiome? If they're fed the same feed, do they have the same microbiome? And the answer is a lot of the time, no. But what there is a similarity in is discipline. So dressage horses across the board will have a much more similar microbiome than they would to show jumpers or to eventers. But it's not just discipline, it's the level within that discipline. Because let's face it, when you're doing up to about medium level dressage, the horse is not working any harder and probably not being stressed much more than a leisure horse. And it's this stress that makes the big difference, because stress really negatively affects the microbiome. And this stress causes imbalances. So things like what the flight mechanism, the norepinephrine that is released as a result of stress, promotes the pathobiome. So you get a higher level of undesirable microbes. And again, you can see within your management strategy what's happening to the microbiome. Because there are 4 behaviors that are indicative of compromised welfare: oral stereotypies, crib biting, windsucking; locomotionary stereotypies, so weaving, box walking; aggressiveness; and unresponsiveness to the environment. And often you would see a horse just simply looking depressed. And if your horse has got any of these issues, you have got an altered and less than ideal microbiome. There's also been noted a correlation between amylolytic bacteria and bowing. So when a horse is literally screaming, neighing, or rather incessantly looking for companions or very worried about the environment that it's in, it's going to have a higher level of amylolytic bacteria. So that then interferes with starch digestion and ups the lactic acid level in the starch, which is not in the gut, which is not what we want at all. We also see that we get a decrease in proteobacteria and cecal populations of bacteria following stress and traveling. So this is why I say about the traveling is very important indeed, to try and ensure the horse still eats and eats high quality fiber. There are management things that we can do to help promote a healthy microbiome. Shavings versus straw bedding had an impact. The straw bedding actually reduced aggressiveness, and that was mirrored in the gut microbiota. Now, at the moment, we don't know which way around it is, chicken and egg. Does the gut microbiota change and therefore the horse becomes less aggressive? Or if the horse is less aggressive, does it allow the gut microbiota to change? Now, I'd be a little bit worried about high performance horses being bedded on straw in enclosed environments, and because of the dust factor. But there's lots of things. What this is suggesting here is that the horses are foraging around in their bed and probably eating a little bit more fiber and really just displaying their natural behaviors. And there's ways in which you can get around that to make sure that the horse is getting that sort of benefit. Horses with microbiome housed individually, their microbiomes can be improved by adding some field downtime. And that's probably to do with socializing and really just allowing a horse to be a horse. And however much we're very inclined with our dressage horses, they're worth a huge amount of money, to not want to put them out in the field in case they get kicked by somebody else or they go galloping around and injure themselves. And that is understandable, but there is ways in which they can have some field downtime and actually benefit their overall health from that. This study also found that if you temporarily turn horses out to the field with others, you get a positive effect. So you get an increase in the sputarate, ruminococcus, coprococcus. And these lasted 1 month. So you got a beneficial impact on the immune system and the metabolic homeostasis. So really doing that management side of things, getting them out and allowing them to be horses while also doing the training, you will have a much happier, healthier horse. Other positive effects of fiber on the microbiome, well, Julian and Grimm in 2017 found that hay diets actually initiated a higher diversity and richness than cereals. And we now know from the human microbiome work that the high diversity is indicative of good health. Fiber reduces crib biting, and you can get higher ghrelin levels, regulates the hunger, the gut motility, the anxiety, stress, and fear. So it's very important indeed to ensure that we're having this positive effect. And we can manipulate the microbiome to ameliorate hypervigilance in horses. We do have issues though with high fiber. Fiber is low in nutrient content. Energy and protein can be very variable, as indeed can minerals. But the biggest negative of fiber is the low biological value of the protein. Some largely forage sources are unavailable in the small intestine. Alfalfa is available, about 50% available in the small intestine, but it doesn't have as good a biological value, so as good an amino acid profile as things like soybean meal and indeed peas and beans. We're also a little bit concerned about the hygienic quality. We can deal with that by feeding treatments, and of course the heat increment. And this is something that you will need to manipulate depending on where your horse is competing. So looking at the protein requirements, we need to calculate the protein requirements in grams because it prevents overfeeding. The horse needs high quality protein, but it doesn't need too much. And too much protein will cause the breakdown of that protein, deamination, and then it will drain energy to be excreted. Or if there's too much, it will end up putting fat on the horse. We've got to target the small intestine available proteins, so things like soya beans, peas, etc. is best. Lots of people rely on cereals. Okay, but cereals are a bit low in lysine, so again, not ideal and not as good as soya. Dust, well, low dust forages is possible to get, and if you can't get that, then you've got to treat before feeding, so either soak or steam it to reduce the dust, particularly when traveling. Very important indeed. Looking at the heat increment, this is a little bit more of a challenge sometimes for people in hot climates, because 2/3 of the energy is lost as waste heat in horses. So what we want to try and do is minimize the amount of undigestible fiber in the cell wall in the diet. So don't feed things like straw and very fibrous hay, because that's that unwanted ballast that sits there that's not actually giving the horse anything. And it has to be processed. It has to be fermented before it can be excreted. And therefore, there's a lot of waste heat from it. So again, highly digestible fiber sources, soya hulls, highly digestible fiber proprietary feeds, alfalfa, chopped grass, sugar beet pulp. Any of these what are now termed as super fibers. And we can feed fat. Only 1/6 of fat is lost as heat increment. So it's really an excellent nutrient for dressage horses to have. So fat in the small intestine of the horse, why are horses so good at digesting fat? Well, this is a study that we're just completing at the moment. And these are the levels of enzymes that were found in 20 horses post-slaughter, and we knew what we'd fed them beforehand. And you can see the actual levels, so the amount and activity of the lipase is really very high indeed. And this explains why horses are very efficient. We didn't expect it to be that high, but they're very efficient at digesting fat. So you can feed a mil of fat per kilogram live weight per day, up to about 20% of the diet. Very few of us would need to feed that much, but that would be your upper limit. You shouldn't be feeding too much fat if the horse is overweight by any means, but it's a very useful ingredient for animals working hard in a hot environment. You do need to acclimatize to this, though, 3 weeks to maximize that glucose sparing effect. And there was another interesting study in Egypt where horses were fed rice bran, had an odds ratio of 0.47 less likely to have colic. So that fat and fiber combination was really had a positive benefit on the gut. Looking now at feeding cereals and our glycemic index, cereals are a little bit of a problem. They're very valuable, but we've got to feed them in the right way. And undoubtedly, when you feed cereals, particularly something like oats, because it's very quickly digested, you do get this glucose peak. So the way that we can feed this and prevent this from being an issue is to feed small amounts. So it's absolutely imperative that you don't go above the 1 gram of starch per kilogram live weight per meal. So that's the actual amount that the small intestine can deal with, and will keep, if you feed quite a few small meals in the day, it will keep the level fairly flat. Now, just to dispel a little bit of a myth, these levels have been quoted for a long time, that the amylase production in horses is inadequate because the pig produces 107 and the rat 56 and the horse only 2.3. Well, the fact that the pig actually produces about 100 times more than it actually needs on a very high starch diet, it seemed to be missed in this information. So the horse does have enough amylase, and in fact, we've got some information here on all of these enzymes that actually digest that soluble, that sugar and starch component of the diet. And we've got very respectable levels and activity of amylase and glucosidase. So horses can do this, but provided you feed them in the correct way. It's just as much about how you feed them as what you feed them. Managing the glycemic index then is really small meals, probably 4+ meals a day, and just delay that forage for an hour. Allow the cereals to go through the small intestine and be properly digested before the fiber comes and starts to push it through from the other end. The important thing about glucose, though, for high performance horses, and it's the same for dressage horses, is that glucose is required for glycogen repletion. Now, you can replete muscle glycogen with high quality forage, but it can take quite a bit of a long time. And you also need to have a very high quality forage to do that. When horses are working, if they're working at only 30% of their VO2 max, they're using 60% of their fuel is from fat, 30 from glycogen, and 10 from glucose. If they're working at 60% of their VO2 max, which they will be doing when they're working very hard and during competition because of the added mental strain, you're up to 70% of the glycogen. So therefore, this is one of the reasons why nutritionists say to me, I can't recommend feeding top performance horses a fiber-only diet. They just don't seem to do well on that. And it's again what Dr. Crandall has just said, and I'll emphasize, you do need some soluble carbohydrates to maximize the use of everything else, but you particularly need the soluble carbohydrates for glycogen repletion. And this was demonstrated that the horses are very slow at glycogen repletion, much slower than humans. It takes around about 72 hours. Horses on low soluble carbohydrate diets had only replenished 63% of their glycogen in 72 hours, whereas those on higher levels replenished nearly all of it, 94%. So again, that's something that needs to be thought of if you're going to a weekend or a several-day competition and you want your horse to perform day in, day out. You need to find a way of trying to replenish that muscle glycogen. So deciding the work level and recovery period is very, very important. You might need to alter the diet during repeated bouts of exercise, particularly if you're competing, but really you want to think of a minimum of 72 hours from whatever they're fed. And it's not just the work that they're doing in the arena, it's the traveling there as well. So you've got to think of the whole picture. Decisions re the cereal feeding, you need to decide the work level, recovery period, and you might need to alter the exercise, but the provision of hypertonic electrolytes is also very important. Electrolytes influence glycogen repletion. So there's lots of different levels that you need to think about. Provision of hypertonic electrolyte, you get glycogen repletion, 15 versus 5.7 millimoles per kilogram dry weight per hour in the first 4 hours compared with those not fed electrolytes. So this is, it's very clear. If you feed electrolytes, again, it's like having those other nutrients there. It's all about balance. Having those other nutrients there will help with the glycogen repletion in the muscles. So the diet for the dressage horse should be based, like it is for all horses, on 2 to 2.5% of body weight in dry matter per day. You must feed for fitness and not for fat. Feed for the work that the horse is doing, not what you think he is doing. Major on fiber and fat where you can. So the bulk of the diet should be fiber and fat. And then some cereals are probably necessary, particularly at the higher levels, for glycogen repletion. Feed small amounts of cereals in several meals per day. If you do that, you can actually end up feeding a reasonable amount of cereals without causing any glycemic index issues or any lactic acid buildup. So you might need to be feeding 4 or 5 times a day. Add small amounts of quality protein. Soyas and beans and peas are better in biological value than cereals. And you'll find that you end up only having to feed literally a cup of that a day. But it's a much better protein source than cereals. And of course, electrolytes. You must feed electrolytes to enhance the overall welfare, the muscle work, but also, as we've just seen, to be able to enhance muscle glycogen levels. And just as an end note to this, there was a very interesting paper given by Professor Proudman at the European Equine Health and Nutrition Congress a couple of weeks ago. And he did a longitudinal study looking at 52 racing thoroughbreds, and he followed them from birth to 3 years of age. And he found astounding things about the influence of the microbiome, in that the microbiome at 1 month of age is pretty much set from there on into adult life. But the diversity and the health of that microbiome at 1 month of age has a major impact on the animal's performance and on the health issues. And I don't see why dressage horses would be any different. So if you have dressage horses, you're breeding dressage horses, it's very important to look after that gut, because that's what will influence your later competition. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to entertain any questions during the question session.